The movie begins when the people of France turn against the royal family and ultimately they decide to behead Queen Marie Antoinette of France publicly. They bring her in front of the charged crowd, remove her head from her body, and show it to the crowd while the people cheer this act. Corsica-born military officer Napoleon watches the action. Later, the judge declared the reason for beheading the queen as she was harmful and treacherous for the state, both of which are grave sins in the national interest. After that, the government officials discussed the siege in Toulon. Napoleon suggests that since their men lack weapons, they must focus on capturing the fort that dominates the harbor. That way, without losing most men and lacking weapons, they will win against the British army. The government officials liked his idea. Napoleon noticed that the people in France were in love with the idea of revolution, and at the same time, they hated royalists. The soldiers have become lazy in all the chaos, and the weapons are rusty. He focused on repairing the damaged guns and planned to disarm the British fleet. That way, they will block the course of the British army. After satisfactory preparations, he attacks the fort of Toulon in the darkness of night. His men surrounded the fort while the British army was unaware of their arrival. Napoleon smartly surrounded the fort with his men and fired the cannons on the fort. Immediately, his army begins infiltrating the fortress through the giant ladders. As he tries to advance, a British cannon kills his horse, but Napoleon keeps walking towards the fort and enters inside. Once they take over the fort, Napoleon commands his army to throw the enemy's forces down the fort and throw the cannons on their fleet, which completely destroys the British fleet, and France wins at the harbor of Toulon. Napoleon got recognition in France soon after that victory. Government officials see the passion of revolutionaries as a harm. The judge who ordered the execution of the queen faces trial and tries to flee the court. Then he commits suicide. The French government freed more than 41,000 prisoners. The hunger rate is strikingly high in France. At the same time, people make fun of the act of beheading the queen in local puppet shows. After such a party, Napoleon sees a pretty girl sitting on a table and cannot lift his gaze from her face. She soon notices him and asks why he is wearing this weird suit. That was a brief and funny encounter with Josephine. The next day, a boy comes to Napoleon's office asking for his late father's sword. He shares that his mother has sent him, and she thinks that Napoleon is the only man who would hear him. At first, Napoleon refuses to return the sword, but later that day, he takes one of the swords from the prisoner's weapons room and goes to Josephine's home. He hands over the sword and says he is the French army general. Josephine and Napoleon start meeting in public. Then one day, Josephine invites him to her home. She asks him to have a physical relationship with her. During that time, the royalist mob of 20,000 people turned against the council. After hearing the rumors that they will attack the councilman asks for Napoleon's opinion. He promises to advise if he is given complete authority and control. The councilman understands that the man is hungry for power. Then, on 5th of October 1795, the royalists gathered to attack. But Napoleon recklessly ordered the open cannons on the people. That killed many royalists and ended the rebellion. Soon after that, Napoleon marries Josephine. He notices Josephine's friendships with other men but prefers to stay silent. In 1798, after conquering Italy, he entered Egypt. By then, he had grown his army from 4,000 men to 40,000 men. On the other hand, Josephine makes a relationship with another man while Napoleon conquered Cairo with little resistance. He sees the pharaoh's mummy and tries to hear by bringing his ear closer to the mummy's face. Then his general meets him in person and tells him that it's famous in France that his wife has an alleged lover. Hence, giving the charge to another general, Napoleon immediately left for home in France. When he reaches home, he finds Josephine nowhere to be and gets so angry that he throws her things outside the house. But then he lets her in and asks her to apologize. She cries and admits loudly to Napoleon's demand that he is the most important person in her life. Later that night, when Napoleon's anger vanishes, Josephine forces Napoleon to admit that he is nothing without her. Out of sheer love, Napoleon accepts it and cries. He keeps telling her about his bad relationship with his father and cries until dawn. But Josephine makes him promise her that he will never again leave her. After his return to France, he faced an inquiry from the council for deserting the troops in Egypt uninformed. But he turns the discussion in his favor by pointing their attention to irregularities in the state affairs, as he now intends to sit and look after the government. Later, a government official meets Napoleon and tells him that he is their Caesar and is the right person to end the corruption in the country. He suggests 3 councils, including him and Napoleon, will rule the country. The next day, he sends the resignation letter to 5 councilmen and takes their resignation forcefully. In November 1799, during the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon and his friend formed a directory of 3 councils. But when the discussion in the room turns against Napoleon, he runs towards the outer door with his friend. They provoke the National Guards that the council tried to kill Napoleon and take them inside the hall. They arrest all the men inside. Then, taking Josephine with him, Napoleon made a public appearance for the first time as supreme leader in France. Napoleon came to live in the royal house and enjoy the royal life. He first brings his mother to meet Josephine, but she does not give her much attention. After becoming the supreme political leader in France, Napoleon asked for the advice of his military officer, Armand, on invading Russia. He shares that Tsar Alexander is a young man who desires to remain popular with his people, so Napoleon thinks that he can be their ally. He sends his man to the Emperor of Austria to pledge his allegiance to him or prepare for an invasion. But in response to Napoleon's letter of peace, England showed no interest. So Napoleon uses foul language with England's ambassador. The ambassador pitied him to be a very ill-mouthed ruler. It seems to the advisor Charles that Napoleon must change his title from the First Council of France to the King, just as they call the King the supreme leader in England. The idea amuses him. At the same time, Napoleon is concerned that Josephine has failed to bear him a child after so many years of their marriage. He uses her for his carnal needs frequently and suggests she get a checkup with the doctor. Napoleon wears the crown in a ceremony and gets the title of the king. He wears it himself, telling everyone that he won it through his sword. Next, the advisor Charles urges Napoleon to divorce Josephine and remarry someone who would give him an heir. As a power-hungry king that night, Napoleon tells Josephine ruthlessly that he will divorce her if he does not bear a child for him. Josephine gets angry, but Napoleon forces himself on her again that night. Even after knowing their strength of Napoleon increasing and his war strategies, the narcissist Tsar Alexander of Russia waged war against him. He convinced King Francis of Austria to side with him in this battle. In Russia's freezing weather, Napoleon silently advances towards the city to attack. When the Russians came to fight, Napoleon asked the infantry to take a position on the higher grounds. They surround them effectively, and when the Russian army advances, they fire cannons on them. That breaks the ice, and the Russian and Austrian troops drown in the cold water. It kills many people. So, King Francis of Austria came to Napoleon and surrendered. Napoleon accepts this and behaves nicely with him like a king treats another. A woman in the palace arranges for Napoleon to be a surrogate who will bear his child. For that purpose, he drinks a lot of wine and plants his seed in the 18-year-old girl. The girl gets pregnant, and Josephine finally asks him when he will divorce her. Because she is tired of the tenacious situation, she tells him that his child would be a bastard for being born into a girl outside of marriage. Napoleon was so concerned about the status of his child's mother. But his advisor calms him down by telling him that there is no way he can bear a child with the Empress. So that's the only way to have his heir. That night, Napoleon expresses his love for Josephine, but tells her he will finally divorce her. But they will remain friends. They present before the judge to sign the divorce deed. But Josephine had tears, and she hesitated before signing it. But Napoleon slapped her and forced her to do so in the country's best interest. Josephine knows that Napoleon's ruthless ambitions cause her endless suffering. She leaves the palace and comes to a faraway home in France. Napoleon visits her in that house and tries to cheer her up, but he does not feel that she has grown colder and sad. He insisted she write him a letter each day. Then he meets the Tsar of Russia. As a vile and narcissistic man, he knows little about the war and victory. So Napoleon asked for the hand of his 15-year-old sister and offered him an army of 5,000 soldiers gathering to conquer England and Asia. Napoleon makes the same offer to King Francis and asks for his daughter's hand in marriage. He marries the Archduchess of Austria and creates a stronger bond with the king. Soon after that, Napoleon's son and heir were born. He immediately reaches Josephine's home to show her. She reluctantly takes the baby in her arms. Then he writes Josephine in his letter that Russia and England have joined hands against him. So he and the armies of Austria, Poland, and Turkey will attack Russia. In 1812, his army fought fiercely against the Russian and British troops. Many men die, but he conquers Russia and enters Moscow. But the city was strangely empty. No man, woman, or children were in the town. But in the intoxication of victory, Napoleon did not think about it much and stayed in the city for the night. In the middle of the night, he woke up and watched the city burning. It turns out that the Russians burnt their town with their own hands, and now Napoleon and his army have one chance to escape. He angrily decides to leave the city and wait in the Russian areas. But he would have to endure the Russian winter that his men and horses cannot handle. He writes to Josephine that it seems that her luck has abandoned him. Ever since he left her, he has been facing hardships. But she keeps writing him back to soothe him. His army faces the worst cold weather and famine. The shortage of food supplies and lousy weather killed many soldiers, so he returned to France. At the same time, Austria and Russia formed a coalition with England. Of the 6 lakh men, only 4,000 survived. On his return, the French council exiled him and gave him a pension. They give him the island of Elba, and Josephine can keep all her properties. He sings the agreement. The Tsar Alexander comes to Josephine's house. He makes her realize that she can have a cheerful life again. They became friends, and the news spread in the country. Napoleon gets so angry to read the news and writes to Josephine that it's been a year on that island. Soon, his exile will end, and he will return to reclaim her and France. But Josephine gets a disease in her oral route. She suffers severely from diphtheria. On the other hand, Napoleon's exile ends, and he begins to march towards France with his loyal men. That news spreads quickly. At the same time, Josephine loses her ability to speak. She gets completely bedridden, and her daughter cries, seeing her in pain. On the border of France, the army stops him, but he shows he has no weapons and only wants to talk to the general. Then, he recognized that the Gift Regiment fought alongside him in many battles. He asks them to stand by him as there will be many victories. They join him and accept him as their leader again. Then he goes to meet Josephine, but her daughter tells him that she died a few months ago. When he asks her to give him his letters, she reveals that Advani has already taken them. In March 1815, the Congress of Vienna decided to end Napoleon's existence for the peace of France. If they do not finish him, he will make it impossible for them to sleep peacefully in the coming days. This time, Napoleon made a better strategy to fight against the united forces of England and Russia. He knows how to win in the cities. On the day of battle, both armies stand before each other. Heavy rains start initially, and Napoleon tells his army to wait until the rain stops. But the general keeps moving. After moving ahead, they see that Napoleon's troops are sleeping. They stay 12 miles away and plan a frontal attack. The shooter takes Napoleon in sight, but the Russian general refuses to execute him. At the same time, Napoleon commands his army to attack Russians with cannons. The Russian and English troops are 5 miles apart, but Napoleon refuses to advance until he sees General Bluecat. On the other hand, united armies surround the generals, but this time, Napoleon's men attack them from all sides. Then finally, Napoleon came out of his camp and rode with his battalion towards the battlefield. He reorganized the army and attacked again. But seeing that he is losing in front of the British military, he returns and waves his sword to General Bluecat. Afterward, they detain Napoleon on a ship. One day, General Bluecat comes to meet him. He shared the news that the British government can't keep him here. So along with 3 generals and 9 servants, he has to live in exile on the island of Helena. He leaves for the island on October 15, 1815. He remembers his beloved Josephine, who wished she would become the emperor and Napoleon as his queen in her next life. So she will do what he did to her. He lived there for the rest of his life, revising the history of France with the kids of the island. He died after 6 years on the island. In the battles he fought, a total of 3 million people died.